When Mark Davis, 31 years old, an unemployed mechanic for 6 months living on his last $200 in a rundown studio apartment in East LA, walked into Carter's Auto Works, desperately seeking any opportunity, he couldn't imagine that this morning would completely change the course of his life. As he waited in the reception area for the owner Vincent Carter to interview him, he witnessed something that made his blood run cold. 2 mechanics deliberately sabotaging the engine of a bright red Ferrari to then present the owner with a fraudulent estimate of $35,000 for non-existent repairs. And when that owner walked into the shop wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than his annual rent, with green eyes shining with intelligence but also obvious vulnerability about mechanics, Mark found himself facing the most important decision of his life. Stay silent and maybe get the job he desperately needed, or tell the truth and lose everything. What Mark didn't know was that this woman's name was Isabella Morgan, sole heiress to a real estate empire worth $400 million, and that his act of honesty at that precise moment would trigger a chain of events that would prove that sometimes integrity is worth more than gold, and that love can bloom in the most unlikely places when 2 souls recognize in each other what the world has forgotten to value. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching from. The dawn of that Tuesday in October rose grey over Los Angeles, the smog wrapping the buildings like a cold shroud that seemed to perfectly reflect Mark Davis's state of mind. He had spent another sleepless night in his studio apartment in East LA, staring at the water-stained ceiling, doing math that never added up. $200. That was all he had left after paying rent late and buying the bare minimum to survive. 6 months without work. 6 months since the garage where he had worked for 8 years shut its doors, crushed by competition from big chains and the neighborhood's economic struggles. 6 months of resumes sent into the void, interviews that always ended the same way. Overqualified for some, not qualified enough for others, too old for junior positions, too young for senior roles. The job market had become a maze with no exit where men like him, honest workers with grease-stained hands but clean hearts, simply had no place anymore. Mark was 31, but felt like 50. He was born and raised in Los Angeles, son of a construction worker and a seamstress who had worn out her eyes sewing dresses for wealthy ladies in Beverly Hills. He had learned to take apart engines before he could read, following his father on weekends when he fixed old Chevys in their apartment complex parking lot in Inglewood. Mechanics was in his blood, a passion turned vocation, then profession, then identity. Without work, Mark felt lost, like a precision watch stripped of its gears. That morning there was a small spark of hope. He had received a call the day before from Carter's Auto Works, one of the biggest shops in North LA, specializing in luxury cars. They were looking for someone experienced, and his references, despite everything, were impeccable. The interview was set for 9 o'clock. Mark prepared with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. He showered in lukewarm water because the water heater was nearly broken, shaved precisely using a blade that had been changed too few times, put on his only decent jeans and a blue shirt ironed with meticulous attention. His shoes were old but clean, polished until the signs of time disappeared. He looked in the mirror and tried to see the man he had been, not the one he had become. He arrived at the shop 20 minutes early, having crossed the city by bus to save money. Carter's Auto Works was imposing, a modern warehouse of over 10,000 square feet, with 8 hydraulic lifts, cutting-edge equipment, and a showroom where cars gleamed that Mark had only seen in magazines. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Maserati, Porsche. Each car was worth more than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. The reception was elegant, with polished epoxy floors and walls decorated with vintage Grand Prix posters and famous circuits. A young blonde woman with a professional smile seated him in the waiting area, explaining that Mr. Carter would see him soon. Mark sat in a leather chair that seemed to swallow him, trying not to look out of place, not to touch anything, to become invisible. It was while waiting, hands sweaty despite the cold, that something happened that would change everything. Through a glass door leading to the repair area, Mark could see the mechanics at work. There were 4 of them, all wearing impeccable blue coveralls with the shop's logo embroidered. They were working on cars that cost more than his entire life. But it was one particular scene that caught his attention and wouldn't let go. 2 mechanics were working on a red Ferrari 488 Spider, a car Mark estimated was worth at least $250,000. One of them, a man in his 50s with a thick moustache, had the hood open and was doing something to the engine, but he wasn't repairing. Mark understood immediately, with the instinct of someone who had spent half his life between wrenches and pistons. The man was deliberately sabotaging something. Mark stood slowly, approaching the glass like a man hypnotized. His expert eyes followed every movement. The man had disconnected a sensor, loosened a cooling system clamp, manipulated something in the injection system. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would blow the engine, but enough for the car to show serious problems, apparently requiring expensive repairs. The second mechanic, younger, was taking notes on a tablet, photographing components, building what was clearly fake damage documentation. They were preparing a scam, a beautiful scam at the owner's expense of this Ferrari. Mark felt his heart beating hard in his chest. He knew these practices. He had heard about them, but never seen them with his own eyes. Unscrupulous shops that took advantage of wealthy clients' ignorance about mechanics to inflate estimates, invent repairs, replace perfectly functional parts. It was the kind of dishonesty he had always despised, the type of behavior he had sworn to his father on his deathbed never to adopt. But Mark was unemployed. Mark had $200 in his pocket. Mark needed this job more than breathing. If he pretended not to see anything, if he looked the other way, maybe he'd have a chance. Maybe Vincent Carter would hire him. Maybe he'd manage to pay next month's rent, fill the fridge, send something to his mother who lived on a meager pension in a small town in Arizona. He was still fighting this internal battle, sweat running down his back despite the cold of the air-conditioned waiting room, when the shop's main door opened and she walked in. Isabella Morgan was the kind of woman who stopped time when she entered a room, not through ostentatious beauty or flashy clothes, but through something more subtle and powerful: presence. She was 29 years old, with light brown hair pulled back in an impeccable chignon, green eyes that seemed to see through things, and a cream-colored suit that gave her an air of authority tempered by elegance. She carried a leather bag Mark recognized as heiress, and high-heeled pumps that echoed on the floor like drumbeats announcing her arrival. But what struck Mark, more than anything else, was the expression on her face. It wasn't the arrogance he expected from someone who could afford a Ferrari. It was worry mixed with hope, the vulnerability of someone who knows they don't understand something important and must trust in others' honesty. Vincent Carter appeared immediately like a vulture smelling its prey. He was a corpulent man in his 60s, grey hair slicked back, smile that never reached his eyes. He shook Isabella's hand with false cordiality, guiding her toward the area where her Ferrari waited with the hood still open. Mark didn't think twice. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He crossed the waiting area, pushed the door to the workshop, and entered the work area with his heart beating so loud he could hear it in his ears. What he was about to do would probably condemn him to remain unemployed. But in that precise moment, looking at this woman who was trusting people who were going to scam her, Mark Davis remembered who he really was and decided that some principles were worth more than despair. The sound of his footsteps on the concrete floor made all heads turn. Vincent Carter stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing into 2 suspicious slits. The 2 mechanics sabotaging the Ferrari stiffened like they'd been caught red-handed, which was exactly the case. Mark stopped a meter from Isabella, completely ignoring Carter and looking directly into her eyes. In a firm voice that barely hid his inner trembling, he said he needed to speak with her. that there was something she needed to know about her car before signing any estimate. Isabella looked at him with surprise. Vincent immediately intervened in a harsh tone, demanding to know who this man was. But Mark didn't stop. He explained he was a mechanic, that he had seen through the glass what they were doing to the Ferrari, and that if she signed that estimate, she'd be scammed out of tens of thousands of dollars for completely unnecessary repairs. The silence that followed was so dense you could cut it with a knife. Vincent Carter turned scarlet, the veins in his neck swelling dangerously. But Isabella remained firm, staring at Mark with growing intensity that seemed to weigh every word he had just spoken. Then she did something unexpected. In a calm but authoritative voice, she asked Mark to show her exactly what he meant. Vincent protested vehemently, but she silenced him with a wave of her hand that brooked no argument. Mark approached the Ferrari. With hands that knew engines better than their own pockets, he began showing Isabella the deliberately inflicted damage. The disconnected sensor here, the loosened clamp there, the injection system manipulated subtly, but obviously to an expert eye. He explained in simple terms what each sabotage would cause, how they had built a perfect scam for someone who didn't understand mechanics. 14 minutes. Mark spoke for 14 uninterrupted minutes, while Isabella listened in silence, asked precise questions that revealed sharp intelligence, took photos with her phone. When Mark finished, he straightened up and waited for the verdict. Heart-pounding. What followed was swift and surgical. Isabella called her personal lawyer, put the phone on speaker, and recounted everything in an icy voice that contrasted with the warmth of her gaze a few minutes earlier. She informed Vincent she would file criminal charges for attempted fraud. Vincent tried to defend himself, to deny, but the photographic evidence and Mark's direct testimony were overwhelming. Isabella left the shop without looking back. But before walking through the door, she turned to Mark, and with a simple nod asked him to follow her. Outside, under the grey Los Angeles morning light that was just beginning to pierce the smog, Isabella Morgan looked at Mark Davis with an expression mixing deep gratitude and intense curiosity. She asked him why he had done that, why he had risked the job he obviously needed. Mark answered with disarming honesty. He said some principles were worth more than despair, that his father had taught him a man is measured by his conduct when no one is watching, that living without honor wasn't really living. Isabella listened in silence, then did something that changed everything. She offered Mark a job, not as a simple mechanic, but as her personal advisor for maintaining her collection of vintage cars she kept on the family estate in Malibu. The salary she proposed was 3 times what he earned at his old garage. Mark was speechless, certain he had misheard, but Isabella was serious, deadly serious. She explained she had been looking for months for someone trustworthy, someone with the integrity he had just demonstrated. She pulled a business card from her leather bag, handed it to him with a smile that lit up the grey morning like a ray of sunlight breaking through clouds. That evening, Mark returned to his studio in East LA and for the first time in 6 months cried. But these weren't tears of despair, not the bitter tears of defeat. They were tears of relief, disbelief, gratitude toward a fate that had decided to give him a second chance precisely when he was about to give up. The Morgan estate in Malibu took your breath away. An 18th-century property surrounded by 10 acres of gardens overlooking the ocean. Mark arrived driving his old Honda Civic, feeling out of place. The butler, Alexander, greeted him and guided him to the guest house, a cottage that was bigger than his old studio. The garages housed 23 vintage automobiles, Bugattis, Ferraris, a Lamborghini Miura, a Shelby Cobra. Mark walked among these cars with reverence. Isabella appeared while he was inspecting a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. She wore jeans and a white shirt, hair down. She told him the collection had been her father's passion, the only tangible memory she had left of him. In the following days, Mark immersed himself in work, but what he didn't expect was seeing Isabella almost every evening. She came to the garages after dinner, sat beside him while he worked, asked questions. Isabella was lonely. She had lost her father, who understood her, and her mother Beatrice was cold and obsessed with appearances. With Mark, she talked about real things: pain, pressure, expectations. One November evening, while they were replacing spark plugs on an old Alfa Romeo.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Their hands touched. Both stopped. Time slowed. But Isabella withdrew quickly. Mark remained there, understanding he had just crossed a dangerous border. He was falling in love with the woman who paid him. Winter arrived with fog and small gestures loaded with meaning. Isabella brought him hot chocolate. Mark completely restored the Ferrari 250 GTO to see her smile. But the real world reminded them of the distance separating them. Beatrice had noticed how much time Isabella spent in the garages. One evening, she summoned her and told her she was making a fool of herself, fraternizing with a mechanic. She mentioned David Merchant, son of a tycoon, who wanted to court her. Isabella didn't come to the garages that evening. The following days she was distant, maintaining a painful professional barrier. Then came the evening of the charity gala. Mark observed from his cottage window Isabella in an emerald dress, splendid and unreachable. Beside her was David Merchant with a predatory smile. Mark didn't sleep that night. He had fallen in love with Isabella, but it was an impossible love. The next day he decided to resign, but when he went to find her, he found her in the garages sitting in the restored Ferrari, crying. She looked up with red eyes and said she couldn't marry David, that she couldn't keep lying to herself about what she felt. Mark held her while she sobbed, and when Isabella raised her face to him, eyes wet but also wild and free, Mark did the only thing that made sense. He kissed her. There, surrounded by the cars her father had loved, they found something no class difference could erase. What followed was a period of secrecy and stolen moments. But secrets don't last. It was Alexander who discovered them embracing in the garage. Instead of betraying them, he became their accomplice, remembering that Robert Morgan had fallen in love with Beatrice against his family's wishes. The bomb exploded when Beatrice entered the garages without warning and found them together in a kiss. She screamed that Mark was a gold digger, demanded he leave the property immediately. Mark made the hardest decision. He would leave to protect Isabella. Isabella begged him to stay, but he told her maybe they lived in worlds too different. That night he packed and left the estate. 2 months of pain and separation passed. It was Alexander who ended their forced exile. He came to see Mark with a sealed letter Robert Morgan had left for Isabella. The letter told how he had married Beatrice for love, but money had changed her. He wrote that the only inheritance that mattered was recognizing true love and having the courage to fight for it. Isabella read the letter and made the decision she should have made months before. One Saturday morning in March, the spring sun filtered through the dirty windows of the small suburban garage where Mark had been working for 2 months. He was checking the brakes on an old Punto when the owner called him saying there was a special client. Mark came out wiping his hands on a greasy rag, heart beating normally, expecting nothing. And then he saw her. Isabella was there, standing in the shop's yard, next to a flaming red Ferrari 250 GTO that shone in the sunlight like a giant ruby, the same car they had restored together months before, her father's car. It was parked in that modest place, like a queen in a farmer's market. Isabella wore simple jeans and a white cotton shirt, hair pulled back in a low ponytail, no jewelry except small gold earrings. She looked younger, freer, more beautiful than in Mark's dreams, and he had dreamed of her every night for 2 months. Mark approached slowly, as if afraid she was a mirage that could disappear at any moment. Isabella smiled at him, that same smile that had made him lose his mind the first time, and explained in a calm voice that the car had a problem and needed her trusted mechanic. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he opened the hood, checked connections, ran his expert fingers over components he knew by heart, but there was nothing wrong. The engine was perfect, every piece in its place, every system functional. When he turned around confused, Isabella was holding out a thick paper envelope. Inside were 2 documents that would change his life forever. The first was the deed of ownership of the Ferrari 250 GTO, the masterpiece worth several $1 million that now bore Mark Davis's name as legal owner. Mark began to protest, to say it was impossible, that he couldn't accept something so precious. But Isabella stopped him with a wave of her hand. She explained in a firm voice that she couldn't keep this car, that it was too tied to memories of her father, that it made her cry every time she looked at it. But there was a condition. He had to maintain it, care for it, and occasionally take it for a drive with the original owner who was giving up the title, but not the memories. The second document was even more overwhelming. A partnership contract, detailed and legally binding. Isabella had used a considerable portion of her personal inheritance to purchase an old industrial warehouse near Pasadena, an abandoned 10,000-square-foot building with history and potential. She wanted to transform it into Morgan Davis Classic Restorations, a place where the art of classic mechanics would be respected and celebrated, where customers would be treated with the honesty Mark had demonstrated that day at Carter's Auto Works. And she wanted him to be her 50% partner, not an employee, not a collaborator, but an equal partner in every sense. Mark looked at the documents, then looked at her with eyes shining not only with emotion, but also with an unspoken question. He asked in a hoarse voice why she was doing all this, whether it was pity, guilt, a way to fix things without having to face what they really meant to each other. Isabella laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound Mark had heard in months, that authentic laugh that came from the depths of the soul. She told him it was pure selfishness, nothing noble or altruistic. She told him she had spent 3 months trying to be the daughter her mother wanted, trying to convince herself she could marry David Merchant and live the life that had been prepared for her. But every morning she woke up and the first thing she thought about was Mark. Every evening she went to the empty garages and imagined his grease-stained hands, his calm voice while he explained how an engine worked, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. Then Isabella added something that took his breath away. In a lower but firm voice, she told him she had left the estate 3 weeks earlier. She now lived in a 3-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, paid for with her own money, earned working as a consultant for auction houses, specializing in vintage cars. Her mother had practically disinherited her when she discovered she was refusing David and planning to open a shop, an activity Beatrice considered unworthy of a Morgan. But Isabella had discovered something fundamental. The freedom to choose her own life was worth infinitely more than any inheritance or maternal approval. Mark said nothing. He dropped the documents on the ground, crossed the 2 steps separating them, and took her in his arms with a strength that spoke of 2 months of loneliness and pain. He lifted her off the ground while she laughed and cried at the same time, tears wetting her cheeks mixing with the most radiant smile she had ever had. And then he kissed her, there in that modest shop's yard, surrounded by old cars under repair and rusty tools, under the amused eyes of his colleagues who applauded. And it was the most perfect kiss they had ever shared, because it was the kiss of the second chance, of conscious choice, of love that had overcome all obstacles. 6 months later, Morgan Davis Classic Restorations opened its doors with a ceremony that attracted collectors and enthusiasts from all over the country. The old warehouse had been transformed into a modern temple of classic mechanics, with 6 professional hydraulic lifts, cutting-edge diagnostic equipment, but also solid wood workbenches where manual restoration was practiced as an art. The walls were decorated with vintage Grand Prix posters, and in a glass case stood the first wrench Isabella's father had used as a teenager. Alexander came to the ceremony, officially retired from the Morgan estate, but still faithful guardian of the family's secrets and stories. He brought a gift that made Isabella cry: Robert Morgan's photo album, documenting 40 years of passion for automobiles, with a dedication written in his hand a few months before dying that said, "Life's most beautiful things aren't bought with money, they're built with your own hands and your own heart, and shared with those who know how to appreciate their true value." A year after opening the shop, Mark and Isabella married in a small country church near Napa Valley, surrounded by lavender fields that perfumed the air with purple and sweetness. The ceremony was intimate, with barely 30 guests, all people who had truly mattered in their lives. Beatrice didn't come, still too proud to publicly accept her daughter's choices. But Isabella didn't let that ruin the happiest day of her life. She walked down the aisle alone, with sure steps and head held high, proud of the path she had traveled, toward the man she had chosen, not for what he owned, but for who he was in the depths of his soul. Their honeymoon was a 3-week road trip across California in the Ferrari 250 GTO, stopping in small coastal towns, sleeping in family-run bed and breakfasts, eating in local diners where the owners treated them like old friends. Isabella discovered a freedom she had never known before, the simple joy of waking up without obligations or expectations. And Mark discovered that sharing his life with an extraordinary woman was the true meaning of wealth. 5 years later, Morgan Davis Classic Restorations had become an international reference in vintage automobile restoration. They had 15 employees chosen for their competence and passion, projects arriving from collectors in Japan, Europe, the Middle East, and a 2-year waiting list. But more important than fame or financial success was the reputation they had built. Absolute honesty, transparency in estimates, meticulous respect for restoration, authenticity. And there was also Emily, their 3-year-old daughter, a little girl with her mother's wavy brown hair and her father's deep, dark eyes, who spent her afternoons in the shop, running between hydraulic lifts, getting dirty with grease without anyone scolding her, learning the names of classic automobiles before even knowing how to read the alphabet. She was the shop's undisputed princess, and the mechanics taught her the trade's secrets with the same seriousness they would teach an adult apprentice. It was a Sunday afternoon in November when Beatrice came to see them for the first time. She drove to the shop in her white Mercedes, parked with surgical precision, and entered with the hesitation of someone in foreign territory, fearing what they might discover. Her high-heeled shoes echoed on the polished cement floor as she looked around at what seemed to be a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. But when she saw her daughter, when she saw Isabella genuinely laughing while Mark taught her to clean an old Alfa Romeo's carburetors, when she saw little Emily running toward her grandmother yelling, "Grandma!" with innocent joy, when she felt the warmth and authenticity of this place where people worked with passion instead of obligation, something inside Beatrice broke and reformed into a slightly different shape. She didn't apologize with explicit words because she wasn't capable of that vulnerability, but she stayed for lunch that Isabella had improvised in the office, transformed into a dining room. She held Emily for hours, listening to the little girl enthusiastically tell her the names of all the cars in the garage, and before leaving, she stopped in front of Mark, looked him in the eyes for a long moment charged with unspoken meanings, and said in a softer voice than he had ever heard that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about him. It was the maximum her pride would allow her to admit, but for Mark and Isabella it was more than enough. That evening, after everyone had left and the shop was wrapped in the silence of night, Mark and Isabella sat side by side on the Ferrari 250 GTO, parked in the center of the warehouse, lit only by soft lights that gave the environment an almost sacred atmosphere. Emily slept in the office on a small couch, covered by Mark's jacket, her breathing slow and peaceful with innocence. Isabella rested her head on Mark's shoulder, and after a long, comfortable silence, said something that perfectly summarized their entire journey. She said she had started with a Ferrari to repair and ended with a restored heart, with a life rebuilt piece by piece, like one of their most complex projects. Mark gently kissed her forehead and replied that some repairs are worth infinitely more than all the gold and platinum in the world. That engines can be replaced, but souls cannot, and that he wouldn't change a single moment of this story even if he could go back. And while the vintage cars surrounded them, like silent witnesses to their story, shining under the soft light with the dignity of engineering and design masterpieces, Mark and Isabella knew they had found something few people find in a lifetime. Love built on truth and honesty, the courage to choose happiness instead of convenience, and the absolute certainty that sometimes the most winding and painful paths lead exactly where the soul needs to be to finally find peace. If this story made you believe that honesty and true love still exist, leave a little heart down below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this, stories about real people with real hearts in a world that too often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a little thank you from the bottom of my heart through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Mark's when he decided to tell the truth, even though it would cost him everything, because you chose to stay until the end. And that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.